Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Let me introduce myself. My name is Carolin Roth. I'm a journalist and moderator. It's good to be back here in Brussels, and thank you so much to the esteemed panelists. I'll introduce them in a second. But during this panel discussion, which we want to render as interactive as possible, that means it's your job to put questions to the panelists as well. I'll leave plenty of time for that during the last part of the discussion. We want to talk about some of the important issues that Mr. Fust has already talked about along with Mr. Redonnet. So how do we build resilience in Europe when it comes to trade? How do we diversify the access to resources? And we'll obviously also talk about the elephant in the room. What do we do about China? We might also broach a very interesting question of what happens if there is a change in the White House. We'll see. Lisandra Flach is a director at the IFA Center for International Economics at the IFA Institute, LMU Munich. Thank you so much for being here. You're the co-author of the report that Mr. Fust has presented beforehand. We'll get to you in just a second. Chad, it's great to have you here as well. Chad Bown is senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And last but not least, Luisa Santos, Deputy Director General of Business Europe. Everyone will do a short opening statement, and then we'll dive into the discussion and then take your questions, of course. Lisandra.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and also to be able to talk a bit more about the report that we have just published. Clemens Fust has already mentioned some aspects of this report, so I'll just highlight some additional aspects of this report in these initial statements, and then I'm very happy to discuss further, deeper this topic. So in this report we had two parts, as you have seen before. In the first part we have provided some descriptive analysis on EU's dependence on international trade, and in the second part we have then quantified the costs of different several deglobalization policy-driven scenarios. And so in the first part, just to highlight some additional aspects, Clemens Fust has already mentioned before that what we see in the data, which is quite striking, is this decrease in the importance of the EU as a trade partner for countries outside the EU, and so which shows this decreasing economic weight of the EU, right? And at the same time, we observe this increase in the importance of international trade for the EU. Okay? And this is not true for other countries such as the US or China. Right? And so another aspect that we see and that we observe in the data, which is when we look at input-output tables, so when we look at the whole supply chains, is that we observe clear interdependencies among the United States, the EU, and China, right? Meaning that not only China is important as a supplier, but also Europe is the main supplier of intermediate inputs for the final production, both in China and in the US. Okay, so this shows also the importance of the EU market for the single members. And this is the third aspect that I would like to mention concerning the descriptive analysis, which is the role of the internal market for the single member states, because half of so for two reasons. So one is that half of the value added generated inside the EU is actually coming from inputs imported from other EU member states. So this highlights the importance of the internal market for the single member countries. And the other is the geoeconomic aspect, right? The fact that as a single market, you have then more economic power than as a single member state, which shows, emphasizes the importance of the EU. Now, then in the second part of the report, we have highlighted several scenarios. So we have simulated several scenarios and quantified the economic costs of decoupling, of deglobalization scenarios, but also of geopolitical fragmentation. Both in cases in which you have three groups, so a group of Eastern Bloc and a Western Bloc and non-aligned countries, but also in cases in which these non-aligned countries join one of the two blocs. And so first, I think this is not surprising, right? From all the scenarios that we estimate, in all cases, Europe loses. And this is, I think, not surprising if we think that Europe is highly integrated in global supply chains. But the most expensive scenario by far would be a scenario of decoupling in case the European Union imposes highly restrictive barriers to trade against all other members, against all other trading partners. Right? So this would be the most expensive policy for the EU, with costs in terms of real income of 4.7%. And this is the lower bound, because this is an estimate of a unilateral, in the case the EU imposes unilaterally barriers against the trade partners, but we can also expect that they retaliate and also follow the example of the EU and also impose similar barriers, and in this case the cost will be even higher. Right? And then the two last points. So we have then estimated the cases. So one scenario of fragmentation, one in eastern, where we have two blocks. So one eastern block around China and Russia, and the other western block around United States and the EU. And then simulated different scenarios in cases where you have a third group of non-aligned countries, but also in a case in which these countries join one of the two groups. And so what is perhaps surprising, and this is one figure that Clemens Fuß has shown before, is that China would incur massive losses in this case. Right? So for China, so this implies that in the world of geopolitical fragmentation, so China would have a lot to lose. So in terms of let's say, decreases in real income, in a case of an incomplete fragmentation, this would be around 4.5%, but in a complete fragmentation, it could be of even 8%. So these are massive, massive losses, because these are permanent losses and long-run losses. Okay? And the final point is the strategic role of these non-aligned countries, because we also show how these effects vary depending on where these countries, in which group these countries join. Right? And they can actually even gain if they don't join. If they remain unaligned, so countries such as India or Mexico, they would actually gain if they remain unaligned. And then the question is, what is the impact for the EU or for China and the US if they have to choose a bloc? And these results emphasize, the importance of improving relations with countries, for instance, from the global south. But overall, the results, emphasize the high cost of these protectionist policies that have to be taken into account by policymakers when they design policies to restrict trade flows, and that could have massive implications for real income. So our preferred measure of welfare for real income in the EU.
And there's so much to unpack in that report. I get that, and we'll be delving into some of those details, including how to deal with the global south later on. But first, let's get to Chad. I mean, obviously, there's a fascinating case study playing out when it comes to the geoeconomic question, and that is EVs.
Agree. And I have so many questions for you on your report, too. So I'll hold off for a minute. But first, let me say vielen Dank für die Einladung zur Teilnahme. It's a huge pleasure for me to be able to join you and to come all the way from Washington. So I'm trying to figure out why I was invited. Since I'm not European, I'm American. And I think the story might be a little bit of, we have been forced in the United States and in Washington to think about this geoeconomic question for a while. And so we're maybe, in terms of being confronted with the reality of what's happening on the ground, a couple of years ahead of where you are and having to deal with this. So maybe that's why. I'm going to try to focus my remarks primarily on thinking about things from a European perspective, as sort of a referee, an external referee reviewing what it is that you're doing here, but also obviously with a bit of humility, because I'm not as embedded in European institutions and domestic political realities, and so of course take everything that I say with a grain of salt. So the case study that I want to focus on is, I've been actually thinking hard about this and looking at it quite intently over the last year, is electric vehicles, right? And so it was wonderful to hear from Denis this morning talk about the wide range of issues that DG Trade and the Commission is focused on. But one of the really, really big stories playing out now is this investigation, the anti-subsidy investigation that they're doing into electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles from China. And the story for that is probably pretty clear. There has been a huge, huge, huge surge in imports of electric vehicles coming into Europe from China over the last 2 years or so, basically from zero as this technology has emerged to now kind of swamping the market, and they're coming here. They're not coming into the United States. They're not really going many other places around the world as well. So there was the announcement of this investigation. It was self-initiated by the Commission. This wasn't industry asking for this necessarily. It was the Commission deciding that they wanted to do this. And the immediate response by the Chinese government was to say, we're going to retaliate. We are going to put export controls for national security reasons on graphite. Within days, they said this. Okay, why does graphite matter? Graphite is a critical material that you need to make anodes, and which are critical for the batteries that go into electric vehicles. If you don't have that, you don't have the electric vehicles at all. You look at the data. The EU is the #1 destination for the graphite that is going to be subject to the Chinese export controls. The top 3 EU member state markets for those exports are Germany, Hungary, and Poland, where when you then look at the data about where the battery manufacturing plants are currently exist in Europe and where are being built, that's where they're going. So China's announced that starting December 1st, they're going to set up an export licensing regime, and their argument is that this is part of national security. So this raises to me 3 questions that are basically questions at this stage, but in the spirit of kind of scenario building in this new geoeconomic framework and climate, things that we need to worry about, I wanted to put out there. So the first question is obviously, when China says it's going to provide export licenses, the first question is, who's going to get the licenses? If they're going to allocate it across maybe different countries, is this an opportunity for China to drive a wedge between Europe and the United States, Japan, Korea, the other major importers, right? I said Europe was the biggest importer from China of this graphite. The United States is second, then Korea, Japan. These are all countries that are, building batteries to go into electric vehicles. Is it an opportunity to drive a wedge between those countries? So that's first. Or maybe it's not to drive a wedge between Europe and the United States, Japan, Korea. Maybe it's an opportunity to drive a wedge between EU member states, and to say the states like Hungary, where there's big Chinese foreign direct investment. We already talked a little bit about China's foreign direct investment across Europe this morning, where CATL is building these massive battery factories. Maybe they get the licenses, but maybe Northvolt or all the other European or LG, the Korean battery manufacturers that are building facilities in different member states, they don't get the licenses. So is it an opportunity to drive a wedge between member states, between the competitiveness of different firms within Europe? Also, what is the EU, the Commission level potential response to this? Do they have the right instruments? We've heard from Denis this morning that in addition to things like the anti-subsidy, the trade defense instruments, they've been building out new tools. And the anti-coercion instrument, after what happened with Lithuania and the Taiwan story a couple of years ago, is that a tool that could be deployed here if this were to be deployed, if China were to actually try to differentiate and use it as a weapon between different member states? Would that be an opportunity to use the anti-coercion instrument? Or, and economically as an economist, an export restriction that's applied on a differential basis, so that is granted, so some exports get to go to maybe the plant in Hungary but not the plant in Germany, that actually looks a lot like a subsidy, right? Could this be an opportunity to use the new foreign subsidies regulation, right? Is that tool that's about to be, you know, fully deployed, is that something that would be used in this case here, right? So in any case, when you think about these different scenarios, yes, the Commission has a lot of new tools that it can deploy to sort of try to deal with this, to defend it, or maybe it does it do like it's always done as a WTO dispute, right? The challenge with the WTO dispute is that takes 5 years to play out, but 5 years from now, the electric vehicle industry is going to be established and it'll be too late, right? So these are the new kind of scenarios that we're confronted. Last question, should the EU have known better? Should it have anticipated that this graphite dependency was something that it needed to be worried about and dealt with it ex ante somehow? And if so, what policy instruments would you have done? And hopefully we can talk a little bit about that. This is some of what the United States is doing through critical minerals agreements, things like that. Well, I don't know. I look at the import data, and when you look at the 6-digit data, which is kind of the most disaggregated data that we have to compare across countries, the very products that China said they're going to impose these export restrictions on at the 6-digit level, the EU only imports 22% of its graphite from China. So you might look at that data and say, EU's not all that dependent on China. 40-something% is from South Korea, 15% from the United States. Seems pretty diversified to me. But then you look at the data for South Korea, the United States, none of those countries mine graphite. China mines 2/3 of the world's graphite. So it's likely to be the case that, yeah, the EU might be importing some of this kind of refined graphite products from other countries, the US, South Korea, whatever, but all those countries are getting the raw stuff from China. They're all dependent. And depending on how the export restrictions play out, if those countries get cut off indirectly, the EU will be cut off from that as well. The upshot of all this is when you're trying to do de-risking in practice, it's really, 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 really hard. Even if you've got the policy instruments, the access to information that you need as a policymaker to be able to make informed decisions is incredibly complex. Okay, and I think with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Chad. Over to you, Luisa. How does European industry view this question of geoeconomic security?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Maybe I'll start to say, of course, that we are very conscious of the new reality. I mean, I think Europe, more than any other continent, feel the consequences of our geopolitics impact the real life of citizens, but also business. We have a war in our continent, so we know what the consequences are. We have seen that after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the business community rapidly made a public statement standing behind any measure that politicians would take as a reaction to Russia's aggression. And our support to these measures continue. So we are backing the sanctions, we have always been, and actually most companies even left before their goods or their products were sanctioned. So that's point number one. We know what it is, we have witnessed in firsthand and still are, because we are still confronted with some of the consequences, including higher energy costs. And these we have, it's a very different situation what we have in Europe, where it is in the US, in Japan, or any country in the world. So we are seeing it firsthand. So that's the first point. We are aware and companies are aware. So the second point I want to make is, and I think Denis alluded to it, is what is that needs to be done by companies and what is that the policymakers have to do. And here is where the fine line is. Because of course companies know their operations. Companies know their supply chains. Governments don't. The only thing governments do is look at trade data. So they look at the trade data and they see, so where do we import this product? Where do we export that product? And they assume the vulnerabilities based on this data. They don't have information at detailed points where are the real dependencies, because sometimes these dependencies are not immediate. We don't see them. So this is also, and I think Chad alluded to it, that's why it's a very complex exercise, because you see only the point of the iceberg. You don't see the complexity that is behind it. So the risk is, of course, that if we leave the whole process to policymakers, we will likely get it wrong, very wrong. Because what we want to do is, of course, mitigate the risk. And I think companies want also to mitigate the risk, because as I said, they've been exposed, they know the consequences. But companies have this detailed information that governments don't. We don't want the geoeconomics to be the new protectionism. We don't want national security now be the reason for all the measures that have nothing to do with national security, by the way. So that is the risk. So ensuring that there is a fine balance between indeed mitigating risk, but ensuring that we are not harming too much trade and investment, that is the real issue. Then my final point is what actually we want policymakers to do, because companies are doing their de-risking already. They are taking very different de-risking strategies. I mean, we can argue whether investing more in China is a good de-risking strategy or not. But it's a company decision. I'm not going to comment on that company decision. Others might decide I want to invest more in Europe, or I want to invest more in the US. But it's up to companies to take the strategy that they think is better. The policymakers have to do one thing. They have indeed to ensure that we have measures targeted and proportionate, as Denis said, to protect the overall economic interests of Europe. And this is very important. To protect the overall economic interests of Europe, also the political interests of Europe, because we need to ensure that we protect our own interests. That's important. And they should do this. Either we are talking in a very specific area like export controls, where we actually think we need to do more as Europe. We need more measures here to have a more European approach. We also need to do more in an area like screening of inbound investment, where we still have many EU member states that do not have a mechanism to screen investments. So there's more to do. On other areas, like outbound investment, we have more doubts whether this is really needed at the moment, because we have so much to do yet on the other front. But there's one point where we proactively ask for the policymakers to do more, and that's to give us more options in terms of market. If we want to reduce dependencies from country A, B, or C, we need other markets. We need other countries to export our goods. We need other countries to import certain of our inputs. This is where we need a more proactive policy from the EU. And for instance, of course, the trade agreements are extremely important. Thank you.
Luisa, thank you so much for that. Let's stay with that question, because that's a question that Mr. Fust raised as one of the key points that he wants to be discussed during the panel. So do companies fully internalize the geoeconomic risks? Yes or no? Both of you, I assume, said, well, to some extent, but actually the companies know a lot better than the states, than the policymakers. They have much better access to the data. It's a fine line. So there's not a clear answer from either of you here. Lisandra, come in here. Who should bear the risks? Who should bear the costs?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Yeah, I think this is a fascinating discussion. And so we have been asking firms how they are reacting to supply chains. So since the beginning of the pandemic, we have been asking German firms whether they are already taking action to rearrange their supply chains, whether they are taking their part on these risks, to minimize risks. And it might sound surprising, but what we see in the data is that the majority of firms have already taken action. So we have asked 4,000, a representative sample of 4,000 German manufacturing firms, and the majority of German firms have already taken action to rearrange their supply chains. And what is interesting here is the type of measures that they have taken to rearrange their supply chains. So the most frequently mentioned measure to rearrange supply chains is diversification. So going to the point that you emphasized before, which is widening the network. So firms, 65% of the German firms have mentioned that they have already taken concrete measures to widen their network, so to diversify their supply chains. But also stockpiling is mentioned by, if I remember correctly, 68% of the firms. On the other hand, we were talking about deglobalization before, and what firms answer is that they rarely report what we call vertical integration, so that they are bringing back production to the enterprise. So insourcing is rarely mentioned by firms as a way to de-risk or to to go against supply chains disruption. So it seems that firms are indeed doing something. The question is then what big firms are doing, right? So then, and then Clemens Fuss mentioned before the example of BASF. So how should we deal then with big conglomerates?
Absolutely, but some big conglomerates, I can just think of one example in the pharma sector. They're doing the China for China approach, so carving out the entire business. So obviously, as a European business in China, if we just take examples, you could either pull out completely, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense for most businesses, I would assume, or you diversify, you go to, let's say, Vietnam, you go to Indonesia, Malaysia, you name it, or you do the carve out. Luisa, you were just in China. What are you hearing from European companies as to what the most viable strategy is in terms of minimizing that risk? Because as you said before, they know what makes sense. They know what they should be doing because they have all the access to the data.
Well, I think talking about China is very complex, and this is not an issue only for China. I think in China we basically have two challenges. The first challenge is, of course, what is happening inside China and what the COVID policy has introduced in terms of changes of an increased politicization and an increased intervention of the government in the economy. And of course, this has challenges also on companies. It has challenges also in the way they organize the supply chains. And the problem we have is that this approach of the Chinese government that is translated into legislation, anti-espionage law, data law, is of course many times conflicting with obligations that companies have in countries like the US or in Europe. We are of course very concerned that actually, more even to the geopolitical risk, we have a risk of clash of legislations that will have a strong impact on supply chains, because you will be obliged as a company that has operations in Europe and is selling in the European market to provide very detailed information about how your supply chain is organized, where you're sourcing your products. And if you're not able to get this information from your operations in China, you are in a serious problem. And your people in China might be in a serious situation if they, to comply with European legislation, go against Chinese law, because there you could even end up in jail. So that's the risk.
But is that a reason for European companies to pull out completely? Or are they just sitting on the sidelines right now and watching this very closely? Or they say, hey, we don't want to get in trouble with our own regulations. This is not worth it to us.
What we're trying to do right now is to explain to the Chinese what the legislation in Europe will entail. And trying, of course, to make the Chinese authorities as well understand that some legislation in China might need to be adapted or interpreted in a more flexible way. The data law, for instance, is one, because is one that impacts including Chinese companies, because of course, if you want to be integrated in the world economy, you need to transfer data. That's very clear. If you create too much limitations on the possibilities of companies that operate in China to transfer this data outside China, you're also hampering your own business and your own potential of growth. So we are still trying to make that the legislation is not totally incompatible. But the risk is there, of course.
And they're listening. Chad, I'll get to you in a second, but they're listening as you tell them about the concerns, the Chinese.
We are insisting, so let's see if they are listening.
Chad, you said before you don't necessarily want to wear the U.S. hat in this discussion, but I will ask you to put it on for a second, because obviously the U.S. companies have been in the firing line by the Chinese authorities when it comes to the crackdown. Micron, Apple even, becoming a geopolitical football, obviously. The European companies, not so much just yet. Maybe they're bracing to see what happens. Maybe they will be in the firing line. What are U.S. companies primarily doing? Given that, let's say for Apple, for example, China is a market that they simply cannot ignore and exit. What do they do?
Well, they have to do a number of different things, some of which is they have to comply now with U.S. laws. And so, for example, part of the story with Micron is, the semiconductor companies now have to comply with export control regulations in the United States. Companies, whether you're American, whether you're European, on the CHIPS Act, right? So the ultimate legislation that is there to provide subsidies to build out some additional manufacturing facilities in the United States. There's regulatory guidance that says, if you're going to accept that funding in the United States, it's going to have restrictions on what you can be doing in China. And the Chinese government has reacted to that in various ways against U.S. companies. I think, separately, companies like Apple, and I'm not going to pretend that, I'm at all an insider on how Apple runs their business model. But, interestingly, Apple, when as a trade economist, I like to look at data and match up all of the tariffs, the trade war tariffs to the products that were hit. A lot of Apple's products were largely excluded from the rounds and rounds of tariffs that the United States applied over the course of the trade war. But I think Apple recognized that probably that's not a situation that is tenable forever. And so they have begun to diversify. Now their production structure is very interesting. Apple's a IT company. They don't do a lot of the manufacturing themselves. They farm it out to companies like Foxconn and Wistrom, right? These largely Taiwanese contract manufacturers who set up shop in China and other countries around the world. But at least you read, the press reports and what these companies are announcing is they're shifting some of their supply chains to other places. India, right? A challenging environment, but India is beginning to do more manufacturing of Apple products. So it's happening, and when we look at the trade data on this kind of stuff, the trade data that we can observe, you can start to see, as a result of the trade war tariffs in place, some of that activity starting to move. Or what you can see is, you can see the source of final assembly for the goods that we import into the United States, the ones that are hit with the 25% tariffs. These are the highest tariffs. Some of that stuff is moving out of China and starting to move into places like in India or a Vietnam or a Taiwan, depending on the product and the supply chain you're talking about. But really, at this stage, that's all that we know. It could be that the rest of the supply chain hasn't moved, that all that's happened is the firm that was doing the final assembly in China, recognizing that paying a 25% tariff to get into the U.S. market wasn't really cost effective, they moved their final assembly to a place like Vietnam instead, but they continue to source their inputs in the rest of their supply chain just as they did before. And that's really kind of all that we know. That's taking place. But we do know that things are happening and companies are having to make decisions, and it's getting more and more complicated seemingly every day with a whole host of new policies that are coming along.
But again, to sort of summarize the question here that Clemens Fuß put out, it's primarily the companies that are bearing the brunt of the geoeconomic costs and the risks. Yes or no? It's not the states.
Well, governments represent the interests of companies, but they also represent the interests of workers and consumers. I think in the United States, the evidence is pretty clear that American consumers have borne, a big brunt of the tariffs, the cost of the tariffs in the form of higher prices. So no, I would say it's all of these economic actors. I think the challenge is this question of, do firms always face the incentives that a government, that a state would have to deal with these questions? And I think the answer is no, because the firms are responsible to their shareholders, right? They're not responsible necessarily to their employees or to consumers, right? Yeah, consumers buy their products, but the state has a greater responsibility. It's ultimately the firms that make decisions, but I think the state has a different responsibility than companies.
Clemens, I don't know if the debate is settled for you just yet. You're learning a lot. Okay, let's move on because I want to get the audience involved as well later on. But we've touched on the global south a couple times. Key is we need to be engaging with them. How so? Because it seems obviously the Chinese have been active and been doing a very, very good job at engaging them through trade for a long time, more than a decade now. The EU has something in place, the Beltway, but it's only really in the beginning phase. Is it too little, too late? Lisandra?
Yeah, we have seen before, and I think we have to accept this fact that Europe has lost on economic weight. Right? And our trade partners from the global south, they have also alternatives. And I think as an economist, we always have to think in terms of counterfactual. So what is the alternative? Right? And so taking the example of Mercosur, so a trade agreement that has been negotiated for over 10 years. This is one good example of a trade agreement that should be where we should move forward, to deepen our relations with the global south. So we have shown in a policy brief this year that Europe has lost, in terms of market shares, has lost 25% in terms of. If we look at exports from Mercosur member states to the world, the EU has lost 25% of these market shares. Right? So this shows the decreasing importance as a trade partner. And in fact, China became the main trading partner for Mercosur member states. And so this is what I mean by looking at the alternatives that countries in the global south have. And as an economist, we have to think then in terms of the counterfactual. So if we don't sign a trade agreement, what would be the counterfactual scenario? And Veronica Grimm has actually summarized this very nicely in one comment in a newspaper recently. And I think this is something that we have to keep in mind when negotiating these trade agreements, that the global south has alternatives when it comes to trade. And so we cannot wait that these countries accept all the conditions that the EU imposes. And so we have to move forward.
But sitting on the fence for the countries in the global south is pretty lucrative because they can pick and choose. Essentially, they can trade with whoever they want to trade with, and they often have the resources or access to the resources or mining in some of those countries. Chad, is there, they'll never have to pick sides. It's an easy job for them. And they don't necessarily want to accept all of the conditions that, a bloc like the EU is imposing on them, whether it's climate related or fair labor related, or is that too simplistic of a view from my side?
No, I don't think it's at all. It is simplistic at all, right? You have to, from their perspective, if you're being offered a deal, a market access deal from China with no strings attached, right? You don't have to change anything on labor, environment, or anything like that, which is costly to do to upgrade your standards there, versus a deal from Europe or the United States, which has these strings attached. It's kind of a no-brainer. So let me use that as an opportunity to describe a creative approach that the United States has done through this Inflation Reduction Act to try to at least partially tackle this kind of challenge. And this is this critical minerals agreement kind of approach. And I know there's been a lot of conversation about the critical minerals negotiations between the U.S. and the Commission, but unfortunately it's kind of hijacked the broader issue. So as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, the tax credit for electric vehicles, $7,500, but half of that is, even if you follow all the rules and assemble the vehicle in North America, you can only get credit for it if you source your critical minerals from a country with which the United States has a free trade agreement. Okay, but they've loosely defined it. We're going to consider the United States has 20 free trade agreements, but we're up to negotiating new ones just on these things for critical minerals. We're negotiating one with Europe. Europe, you don't have a lot of critical minerals, so I'm not sure how valuable this thing is, but okay. What we should be doing, because this is valuable to countries, many emerging markets, the Indonesias of the world, right, that have things like nickel. This is a new form of market access, right? If you sign one of these agreements now with the United States, and you know, the nickel coming out of your mines or being processed in your country gets access to a subsidy effectively in the United States that the nickel coming out of China or somewhere else in the world doesn't get access to. Suddenly this is something of value, right? The United States potentially could be negotiating critical minerals agreements and asking these countries, this is going to be valuable to you. This would be really worth it to you. You get sort of preferential access to the US market for this thing. Don't you find that valuable enough to take on some of these environmental, you know, labor standards, whatever that we're prioritizing? So I think that's eventually sort of where we're going, but it's very different, right? This is, we've got a subsidy that you would like to get access to. It's not just the old days of, you know, would you like a lower tariff getting into our market kind of thing. This is much more complicated to think about and to think through in the days of industrial policy in particular. Let's
stay with industrial policy for a moment, because obviously the EU has been incredibly good at providing the stick. In terms of more regulation, the US incredibly good at providing the carrot. So in terms of subsidies, tax discounts, all of that. What can the EU learn here from the US? Or again, is that somewhat too late? The Net Zero Industry Act offering some of that as well, but it's a little more bureaucratic, you could say. Luisa, what do you take away from that whole industrial policy action?
I'd like to comment first on what Chad said. The critical minerals agreement that we are negotiating with the US is indeed more symbolic than anything else. But if the US is really serious about partnering with Europe, at least it should give us that. Because actually the Inflation Reduction Act was seen very much in Europe as a direct attack on European competitiveness. I know that was not the intention, but that was the result. And of course, we have been, as European business, supportive of the objectives. It's great. The US is creating a business for decarbonization, for green technologies, so this is great. It brings a lot of opportunities also for European companies. What we don't find so great is the discriminatory elements of the IRA. Because this is not just something that means we are actually only giving incentives if you create jobs and if you create investment in the US. And we all know that the basis of the transatlantic economies is mutual investments. We said it already. There's a lot of inputs we get from the US. There's a lot of inputs we send to the US. And these are important for our companies. So actually, the Inflation Reduction Act puts in question the basis of the transatlantic economy. And this is why it had such a big reaction in Europe. On your question, and now I talk about your question, I reply to your question, it is what the US Inflation Reduction has as a positive element, apart from creating a business for decarbonizing the US economy, is that indeed it looks at the incentives and not just, it looks at the carrot and not just the stick. So also this is positive. So that's why a lot of European companies benefited from the IRA. They were super supportive. They even increased the investments in the US after the IRA. So we had a learning process there too. And on the positive side, indeed, the EU finally, the European Commission finally recognized that it's not only the regulations that are going to change the economy. You need to create the factors to make sure that there is a business case and that the products that you want the companies to develop, that you have a market for them and you have the conditions for them, because this will require a lot of investment. So the Net Zero Industry Act is indeed a good step. It came late, and it is still rather limited in terms of scope. So we would prefer that it was wider, because the decarbonization will involve a number of sectors, not only the sectors that were included in the
Chad, come in.
net zero.
I just want to say one thing on IRA. So obviously, huge challenges between the U.S. and Europe on IRA. But I want to tell one quick story about that, where I think to give the administration credit, the Biden administration, on trying to address first order some of those concerns for electric vehicles in particular. It goes back to that story. So initially, the main tax credit in Inflation Reduction Act is this thing called Section 30D. For consumer electric vehicles, and it has this provision in it that says only the vehicles assembled in North America are eligible for the tax credit. Even if you get the batteries and the materials and stuff outside of China, vehicle still has to be assembled in Canada, United States, or Mexico to qualify. This has obviously created a huge challenge for Europe, South Korea, other countries. The Biden administration ultimately heard that. And through the implementing regulations, and this was the Treasury Department, it's the part of the tax law in the United States, what they did a year ago in December was to say, okay, there's this separate track. So unfortunately, the Biden administration can't rewrite this law on its own. It's part of, it's a law in the United States. It would take working with Congress. Congress now is split, Democrats, Republicans, after the midterm elections of last November. So they can't do anything by themselves. What they can do is to write the implementing regulations.
Well, sometimes you don't even have a speaker, so,
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we don't even have a government. But what they did do a year ago in December was to say, look, there's a separate track in the Inflation Reduction Act called 45W. It's for commercial vehicles. So generally we think of that as big trucks, right? Lorries driving down the highways, carrying delivery vans, things like that. For the purposes of this law, we are going to interpret commercial vehicles as also being consumer vehicles, things that you or I might get access to, provided they are leased. So you don't buy it outright, you lease it. And if you do that, there's a separate $7,500 tax credit, and that North American assembly provision doesn't apply. Okay, fine. Foreign automakers, leasing, it's not really our thing. It's not really what we do. The Koreans especially, that's what they said. And I looked at the data. They were right. Before this all happened, 2% of their vehicles in the U.S. market were being leased. Subsequent to this announcement, everybody was leasing their electric vehicles in the U.S. market. Essentially, what the automakers figured out very quickly was a consumer comes in and says, I want to buy your electric vehicle. And they say, no, you don't want to buy it. You want to lease it, because if you lease it, you get access to this tax credit and we can kind of share it kind of thing. And the data, the German automakers especially figured this out very quickly, and now it's something 60, 70% of their. So in any case, that was an example where they had the flexibility, the administration really worked hard to try to smooth things out. Now there's other elements of IRA, agree, that are challenging. Not all the problems have been fixed, but where they can, I think this administration has tried to work.
Well, and now we're wondering, the next administration, in a year from now, would they completely roll it back? The current front runner of the Republican Party, he would probably take it all apart. Lisandra, what would that mean? you get the tricky question.
Well, I can go back to our scenarios, right? And so we have. So we could expect, in this case, that the U.S. would impose more tariffs. So it would add way more uncertainty in this scenario. This is something that we have not considered in our quantification exercise, because we look at long-run effects, right? So, but if we look at long-run effects of protectionist policies, of increasing tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, which would probably be a consequence of a new Trump government. This would mean for the EU, I mean, if we look at input-output linkages, the EU is the main, and the whole supply chains, not only manufacturing but also in services. The EU is the main trading partner of the US is the main trading partner of the EU. So even before China. So this is reflected then also in the scenarios that we have quantified before. So if the United States would increase tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, these would increase or would decrease GDP in the EU by 0.5 or 0.8%. So these are massive GDP losses for the EU. And so I just want to go back, or do we continue the Trump discussion, or may I go back to...
Let me just continue the Trump discussion for a moment, and then I'm happy to go back, because I was going to put this question to you, Luisa. So obviously European companies are very wary about doing business in China right now, given the unpredictability of policies there and new laws. If Trump is back in the White House, will they look at the US the same way as they look at China right now?
Look, I think one of the reasons why we still want to find solutions for things like the dispute on steel and aluminium, but even the case, the aircraft subsidies, is precisely because this is an administration that we can talk with. We don't agree in everything. In many things we don't agree. But at least we can talk and try to find a solution. The main challenge, I think, for everyone, both European and US business, is that if we have Trump, is unpredictable. So the question that the business is actually more wary is precisely of unpredictability. And I think in the current context, because we have so much instability in the world, and tensions in the world, this could actually be quite dangerous, not just from an economic point of view, but also from a political point of view. So in concrete terms, I think, of course, everyone is concerned about it. On the other hand, I mean, companies cannot do much. The only thing they can do is try to see if we manage to advance with this administration as much as possible on the transatlantic relation, including addressing the disputes we have, to try to avoid that initially we still have a lot of problems left unsolved. But things like, you know, increasing tariffs from one day to the other, or leaving the WTO, these are things that we have to be prepared, because they can happen if he wins.
And as you rightly point out, you say time is of the essence in terms of what can be done before a potential new administration comes in. Chad, you knew I was going to ask you that question as well. What happens with the IRA if Trump is going to come in? Because the thinking always goes, and the reporting is that, hey, most of the new jobs that have been created by the IRA, through the IRA, they're happening in red states. I think 80% of the new jobs. That's a massive number that not even Trump wants to see go down. So what do you really tear it apart?
So what I learned in the first row seat of the trade war was to never try to predict what President Trump might do. Let me talk about what he can do. And that is, this is law in the United States, and he can't overturn the law unilaterally. He can change the way the law has been implemented through implementing regulations. His Treasury officials can rewrite, the leasing provision, for example, something like that. But he can't, unless Congress flips and is both, Republican in the House and Senate, he can't just kind of throw away the Inflation Reduction Act. So we'll see. His hands could be tied along that dimension. That isn't to say, though, that there won't be significant changes in the Inflation Reduction Act over time, even if President Trump or candidate Trump isn't elected, right? There is a big issue in the United States. It's turning into a very expensive piece of legislation. 2025 is a critical year in terms of opening up a debate again about what the U.S. tax code looks like. The U.S. debt is and deficits are increasing. So that may be a political moment where there's sort of a reassessment or a midterm assessment of where the Inflation Reduction Act take-up of some of these subsidies has been a bit larger than anticipated, maybe some scaling back, maybe rewriting it in ways that are more friendly to key trading partners and things like that. So this is just to say that I think the future of the Inflation Reduction Act, for as much activity and momentum as it's created in its first year, where things sit after 24 or 2025, I think is very uncertain.
And there's also been a huge degree of cost inflation associated to many of the projects, and some of them we've seen offshore wind, of course, running into a great deal of trouble. Time for audience questions. We have 2 microphones in the room.
Okay, I hope it works. So, where are the questions? Oh, here.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I'm here on behalf of the Greens in government in Germany. So it was very interesting to listen in. And one thing that I would be curious to hear your ideas was the keyword, we have to become more creative in terms of how we deal with our trading partners and what we actually have to offer. So in terms of, could it be critical mineral partnerships? What would those look like for Europe? What is there that we can offer besides reduction in tariffs, given that, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism on the IRA, but I think a lot of European countries would have been quite keen to do something similar if we didn't have this double bind on internal market competition and not being able to give this kind of bazooka. So what kind of instruments, what creative ideas are there on what we could offer as an alternative to China to make ourselves more attractive as trading partners?
So on IRA, what the United States has done for these critical minerals, subsidizing effectively a supply chain to emerge outside of China for lithium and cobalt. It's not going to happen in the United States. This is not subsidizing mining in the United States. It's going to happen in places like, Indonesia or something like that. It'd be great if you wanted to help pay for that. Or the Japanese or the Koreans, right? Creating China has so much market dominance in a lot of these critical minerals. It would just be good economics to have more alternative suppliers. They would have less market power. It would be sort of a more economically efficient outcome if we could create redundant supply chains. And if you wanted to help subsidize that somehow, I think the United States would be open to it.
Luisa?
Look, I think we have also our own tools. I mean, we have the Critical Raw Materials Act that actually establishes methods and targets for our increased production of mining in Europe. So are we up to do this? Because that is the challenge. Shadow said this is not going to happen in the US, but this is one of the discussions we're having in Europe. Are we increasing this capacity? Because it's not just having more, is that with an increase in utilization of many of these critical minerals, if we don't do anything, the production in Europe will go down in terms of the share of what we'll have or what we need in the future. I think we need a combination of market access, because that's the leverage we have for negotiations with these partners, is our market, is the access to our market, and also capacity building efforts. And this is, I think, what we're seeing with legislation that we have, like deforestation or CBAM. Some of these partners are ready to implement this legislation when it's feasible, but of course they have very different levels of development than the US. So they are asking us to assist them in doing this, not just slapping the legislation, but making them able to continue to provide goods and services to the European market while providing it in a way that is more sustainable. Then, of course, we have the global gateway, but we really need to operationalize a bit better. We need to make this more of a real European project, and this demands as well that, of course, we act more as Europeans on this. But this is also another alternative, building infrastructure in a way that is more sustainable. But just slapping legislation and making access to the European market more difficult will not get us into partners in the global south.
Lisandra, do you want to comment on this, on just being more pragmatic when it comes to, for example, dealing with the global south?
But yeah, so on raw materials, indeed, I mean, the EU has already the action plan on critical raw materials, right, or the European Raw Materials Alliances. So these are important initiatives. Besides, trade agreements, having these initiatives to create strategic partnerships that some are easier to move forward than regional trade agreements, and might be helpful to gain access to these sources. And then what we have to offer is market access, right, to a huge market, which is the European market.
Further questions? Yeah, there was a couple here.
See me. If you want to see me, I think you can see me also when I'm seated again. Doesn't matter. Ralf Kamphöner from the Confederation of the German Textile and Fashion Industry. I'm heading the office here in Brussels. There was a comment made on diversification of international trade that we were to see. Now, listening to my constituencies and my industry, I hear, with all due respect, rather the opposite, and that is something that might have to do with some self-inflicted things that, we are having here in the European Union, like CSDD, the supply chain due diligence and directive, and which is in the pipeline, and other reporting requirements that make it very difficult for especially small and medium-sized companies to cope with all that. And so the reaction they are discussing or start showing is that they try to limit the risk, and by doing so, rather reduce the number of countries from where they import, and rather buy from larger and fewer companies in those countries, which runs counter, obviously, to the aim of diversifying imports, which, if I understood well, is a declared aim of EU trade policy. So that is an observation. And a very quick question, as we have the pleasure of having Chad Bown with us from the United States. I think in this room we have a lot of convinced friends of the rules-based multilateral trading system and of the World Trade Organization. And hopes were very high when Joe Biden was elected President of the United States that the appellate body of the dispute settlement body of the World Trade Organization would get going again, because the US would appoint the missing judge there. Now, Biden has been in office already for quite a while. Is there any hope that he'll see this disappointment, or can we forget that? Thank you.
Chad, quickly on that. Luisa, maybe on textiles?
Yeah, and I'll even say on your first question, this is something that economists, we have been documenting for decades, is how important agglomeration economies are and scale economies, and what that leads to kind of there's real big efficiency gains from having economic activity concentrated in a certain place. You get access to really specialized workers and input suppliers, and now we're telling firms, don't do that anymore, diversify, right? This is kind of going against some of the fundamentals of economics that we've been seeing emerge in the economy over the last 20 years. So this is not a tricky issue, and thank you for identifying it. And I'm trying to not answer the appellate body question, obviously. Unfortunately, I think from the United States perspective, the answer would be, why would you subject yourself to binding dispute settlement that really only applies on you? So the binding nature. This is not just a Trump issue. I've learned it's a very bipartisan issue for the Congress, right? The WTO rulings have been effective at disciplining U.S. use of anti-dumping, countervail, the kind of trade remedies that are trade defense instruments that are needed to be able to tackle problems like China in terms of trade. The WTO has proven ineffective at dealing with the problems with China on trade and subsidies, industrial policy, state-owned enterprises. So I don't think until we get to a conversation globally where we're talking about a common set of rules that everybody would apply to, I'm not optimistic that countries are going to be willing to submit themselves to binding dispute settlement again, unless new rules are really part of that package. And I'm only loosely following the conversations in Geneva, but I don't think that's where we are on that particular issue.
Very briefly, maybe, given your background in textiles?
No, I think Rolf has a point, because it's not just textiles. I mean, when we're talking about smaller companies, when we see what companies are doing in terms of de-risking, what companies are doing in terms of traceability of supply chains, we're always thinking about big companies. We hear a lot. Many politicians saying, oh, you need to follow the best in class. Yes, the problem is the best in class is 5% or 3%. What about the rest? The rest is the basis of our economy. And these smaller companies don't have the conditions sometimes to have visibility and traceability along the supply chains. So if they don't, and the concern they have is that they could be liable and could be fined, of course, then they prefer to leave some countries and probably to focus on dealing only with one supplier that normally is a big one. Mm-hmm. So you are actually also creating a concentration in the partner country where you're dealing basically with a bigger company. And you're not giving so much growth and so much opportunities for the smaller companies. And this is one of the issues, for instance, we have already now with the deforestation legislation.
Further questions?
So I'm Simone Schibelli from the European Commission, from the unit regarding global economic governance. My question is both on the EU and the US perspective, since we have this opportunity, regarding the crisis and fragmentation of multilateral institutions. So my question is, what industries at first expect from multilateral institutions to do on this de-risking and diversification, how they could help them, firstly, and secondly, what the US is actually expecting to leverage on multilateral institutions to intervene in this kind of national policies as well. Thanks.
Brief answers, please, because we've got more questions. Thank you.
So what we expect from multilateral institutions, we expect them to set the rules, to give us stability, but we also expect them to modernize the rules. We want dispute settlement, and we want a binding dispute settlement. And I think the fact that the EU and many other countries have created these alternative mechanisms is a proof that many countries want a binding dispute settlement.
Chad?
Yeah, I don't have much else to add except to acknowledge that a huge amount of international trade that goes through the WTO is sort of outside of these, you know, the most important issues that are the source of conflict between, say, the US and China or Europe and China. And it would be great if there were binding dispute settlement that all of that could be dealt with, right? And so maybe there are alternative ways that you could deal with that. I don't know, but that's going to take creativity in Geneva to be able to say dispute settlement is going to apply here, but not there. But if it's going to be universal, I'm not optimistic that it's going to be happening anytime soon.
Creativity seems to be a theme these days. Lisandra, do you have a comment or two?
No, just on the WTO. I mean, this is for Europe. Since we're talking so much about Europe, it's crucial. So if you look at the data, 80% of EU imports is actually via the most favored nation regime. So this means that the multilateral trading system is still key for, even though Denis Redonnet has mentioned the whole network of trade agreements of the EU, but as a first best, we still should move forward with a reform of the WTO, even though we know that this is the hardest job currently.
There was a question here, and then the gentleman in the red sweater. There's two, and then Mr. Fust as well.
Thank you very much, Peter Schweiger, former EAS. In the last point of Professor Fust, he mentioned diversification and reshoring also. Now, diversification supply chains is surely much more for enterprise, and they know how to do this. But reshoring is not cost neutral. You have competition issues, you have cost issues, you have shareholder demands. Alone, getting a chip factory to Germany, 10 billion euros, if this happens. Now, I wonder whether Europe, in this international competition, still has enough money to get reshoring in the pharmaceutical industry, in the chemical industry, in other industries, for example. IRA, 750 billion. China is set to subsidize its industries heavily. I have no figures, but wind industry, battery industry, solar industry, all what is energy, they have a lot of money in the global south to finance and to give loans and almost everything for energy-related issues and for transport-related issues. Now Europe has a lot of restraints. The German discussion now, very actual, Schuldenbremse, do we have enough money to get our infrastructure right and to finance reshoring? Europe has laws about stability, debt ceilings, deficit ceilings. So what do you think, has Europe enough money to withhold in this international competition against the US and China, who have no rules in this respect? Do we have enough money to finance reshoring back to Europe to get strategic independence? Thank you.
Who wants to take this?
So I'm going to frame the semiconductor story a little bit differently, and maybe this is optimistic. But we look at the starting point of an amazing company, TSMC, that produces 92% of all advanced node semiconductors in one place, right? Taiwan. Ignore geopolitics. I think now that we're more exposed to climate-related shocks, winds, droughts, earthquakes, public health-related shocks, pandemics, right? The geographic concentration of these shocks is so severe that having that kind of concentration of one of the most important products in the world in one place doesn't make sense for anybody, right? We understand why it happens economically. It's super efficient. These have all these engineers right next to these plants, build these incredibly complicated, expensive facilities all in one place. Economically, it makes a lot of sense. But for society, it does not make a lot of sense. So we need diversification. How do you convince a company like that to diversify? It's hard to really do it through tariffs, right? We're doing it through subsidies. Now, the good news is Germany's not paying for all of it, right? Germany's paying 10 billion. The United States, we're going to pay a couple of billion. Japan is going to pay a couple of billion. And TSMC, over the next few years, is going to build some plants in Germany, the United States, in Japan, and we're going to get that diversification. And so we're sharing that. In my understanding, I'm not in these meetings and I just read in the press like you all, this is what the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, and bilateral efforts between the US and Japan, Europe and Japan, some efforts trying to do to facilitate this diversification and making sure none of us overpays to have this happen. But part of this is agglomeration. Part of this is, the reason why the industry ended up in Taiwan wasn't free markets in the first place, right? It was some subsidies that helped facilitate those kinds of things as well.
But to your point, you said repeatedly, reshoring doesn't make any sense. It's way too costly. If we do want to do it, even if it doesn't make any economic sense, there needs to be some degree of European common borrowing.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure. Yeah. So these are extremely expensive policies. And if you go back to the Net Zero Industry Act that was mentioned before, I mean, it's certainly good to invest in green technologies, but we have to ask also the question of the costs of these investments, right? Because these are also protectionist policies. I mean, imposing quotas for production in Europe is also a highly protectionist policy that is also very expensive for Europe. And we might even, we might also come to a subsidy race in this case. And then we come also to the question of diversification. So in this case, we are probably reducing diversification and might even be increasing risks, because if you have a less diversified supply chain, then risks may be even higher. So the question is, are we then really putting the money in the right policies? So that's probably one of the big questions as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. The gentleman in there.
Thank you. Interesting debate. My name is Peter Wojcik. I'm with the European Chemical Industry Federation here in Brussels. and the sector that has contributing some 40 billion euros annually to the trade balance of Europe. And this has changed very recently dramatically due to COVID, but also due to the energy crisis, war in Ukraine, and so on. What I have seen, this Green Deal avalanche of legislation producing, I don't know, 50,000 pages or so that came down on Europe, has caused, of course, cost increases as well. And we are, I think, one of the very few regions in the world that has imposed itself a carbon price, which is market-driven, but which is also impacting on our competitiveness. So the question is, can we continue with this machinery of legislation? Will trade policies help us out of that, or should we really have a rethink of how we create the common market, but also how we see ourselves in the global economy? Can we continue, or do we need a game changer here to make Europe attractive again for investment from outside? Thank you.
Can I just put this, can I put a question back to you? Because I'm curious, what's the one thing that would help you? I assume, coming from the chemicals industry, lower electricity price, lower power prices.
Yes, so access to competitive energy is, of course, a must. We are energy intensive, and that would help a lot. Also, access to raw materials and so on, all of that will be very helpful, of course. And we are very diversified. Chemical industry is extremely trade intensive, so we are an example, but we are highly exposed right now to these geopolitical frictions, and we have to reconsider where we can produce, where we can invest. And unfortunately, Europe is not a most favored location right now.
Luisa?
Well, I think we should totally share the picture, because the question is, the Green Deal was the main objective of this commission, it still is, and we have always shared the objective. So we want to decarbonize our economy, but of course this will not happen from one day to the other. That's one point. It will not happen only because it is imposed through legislation. We need to have access to investment and finance to be able to do it. And of course, in the meantime, we need to remain competitive. So this was already quite challenging. If we had then the war in Ukraine, that created, of course, a further element, because it increased the cost of energy, that has put a lot of companies, especially those in high energy intensive sectors, in a very difficult competitive situation. So we need to understand whether the legislation that we have been implementing, that we've been adopting, a lot of it will be implemented further. We need, at least during the implementation period, understand if the legislation is fit for purpose, or whether we need to look at the way we are implementing it. And above all, I think now what we need to do is to focus our policies on supporting competitiveness and supporting the economic growth in Europe, because this is really under threat right now. We're seeing what is happening in Germany, but this could spread also to other countries. So I think the US model that is not perfect of the US Inflation Reduction Act was a wake-up call for us. Of course, we are not going to subsidize as the US did, but we definitely need to look at a way of maintaining the companies competitive while they are transitioning. And this, I think, we still have work to do.
A final comment, we only have a few minutes left, but Mr. Fuss, let me put that question to you, because we always talk about Germany being the sick man of Europe. And we just heard from Luisa, well, this really shouldn't be spreading to other member states. Is Europe at risk of becoming the sick region of the world?
That's kind of a million-dollar question, and very broad. I would say yes, the danger is there. I mean, the fundamentals are not great, so we are very affected by fundamental force headwinds like demographic change, declining labor force. We've heard earlier that Europe is more exposed to international trade than other regions in the world. Now, if it's true that we get more frictions, this will also slow down Europe and will hit Europe more than others. Europe has just been hit by the change in international energy markets, cut off from gas supply from Russia. So it's a number of risks. And the question is, how does Europe respond to these shocks? And you do get the impression that we don't really have a very consistent response. And that takes me to a question I was going to ask, if I may, to the panel, and because it's related. So you get the impression that the US has sort of a rather activist stance towards China, trying to rein in the country and push it out of value chains. Whereas Europe, probably as a result of thinking about growth opportunities in the future, seems to have a different view. I mean, if you think about this as an economist, you would say, okay, so the US is withdrawing from China trade. This creates opportunities inevitably, and that's very strong economic force for the rest of the world. So it's plausible that Europe will try to move in and, you know, take over this business. Of course, we cannot say so, but if you listen to European policymakers nowadays, what they seem to pursue is some kind of, let's call it, smart ambiguity, saying like, oh yes, you know, China is a problem, but we also want to cooperate. And you could say what they're saying is, okay, you know, the US, you can struggle with China in the Pacific and we'll take over the business. So my question would be, I mean, if that is a growth opportunity for Europe, it's not very noble maybe, but if that is a growth opportunity for Europe, what does the panel think about how this will play out? I mean, one scenario would be that the US gets angry and this Western bloc, if it ever existed, falls apart even more. Or do you think the US would kind of tolerate that? Or how will this all play out?
So if Europe becomes more opportunistic and steals business from the US, just in plain terms, what would the US do, Chad?
More opportunistic? I mean, we've already seen that in the data, right? And some of this was China's own policy. So interestingly, during the trade war, not only did China, you know, retaliate against the United States by raising tariffs, but they actually lowered their tariffs toward Europe and everybody else. They lowered their MFN tariffs deliberately to incentivize it. And absolutely, we have seen, you know, we call this trade diversion as economist terms, but China and Europe trading more with each other. Europe has become more dependent on China kind of because of the US-China trade war. And so that's a question. But if you're thinking about the same time, should we be de-risking from China? That's a question, I guess, for Europe to have to think about.
Luisa, we're running out of time, but I hate to leave this on a pessimistic tone. Tell me one or two things. What makes you optimistic about Europe at this point when it comes to global trade?
Well, I don't think we are taking the US on the Chinese market. That's for sure. But there are opportunities in China because there's a lot of trade that is not risky. And this is why we need to really get it right. What is risk and what is not risk? Because, I mean, we will continue to do business with China, so will the US. So we need to clearly differentiate what is risk and what is not risk. We also need to ensure that we engage more with the ones that, countries that we call the non-aligned, but have a lot of opportunities to growth. India, Indonesia, other countries, because if we don't, then we are creating blocks. It should not be the G7 against the others. I think that is very important. The risk of really, really entering the world where we have a war economy or where we have really potential more conflict is something we should avoid. So there are opportunities if we manage to avoid that.
You see a lot of opportunities. Steffi's final comment. What makes you optimistic about Europe? One thing.
I was going to say things can hardly get worse, but it's not true. No, I think there is a lot of potential. I mean, my answer to that question regarding Germany is often we have still have a wide range of very successful companies. We have, if you look at patenting activities and things like that, indicators for innovation. So there is a lot of potential. I think we just need to avoid this view that has been prevalent in Europe for a long time, that we can afford any kind of, counterproductive anti-growth policy. And I think we are now getting to the point where we can't afford it anymore, and we need to shift direction a little more towards future sources of economic growth. And if we achieve that, I think we'll be doing okay.
All right. Yes.
Yeah, I think one additional point. So looking at the bright side, Europe is first of all one of the pioneers in terms of the number of trade agreements. Right, so we have a huge network of trade agreements, and also if we look at the data in terms of diversification, in general, the supply chain of Germany is highly diversified. So we have critical dependencies, but in general terms, we have a highly diversified network, which is an advantage certainly for Europe.
It's not all bad. From the outside, what's going well in Europe?
Europe really is the beacon on, I know it's costly, but on climate policy, right? And so carbon taxes, and we're watching, is CBAM going to actually induce the third countries in the world to actually do carbon pricing, which as economists would be what we would like to see happen. So we're maybe seeing, there's signs of it, right? Turkey, Vietnam. So the question for Europe is, can it continue to play that leadership role when it comes to climate? I know the United States and IRA is putting pressure in the other direction, making it more difficult, but maybe things change in the United States as well, and maybe someday in the not too distant future, we actually recognize that carbon pricing there. We need some revenue, government revenue too, to pay for all these subsidies. Geez, maybe that would be a source of it.
All right. On that note, we'll break for lunch. We'll see you back here at 2 o'clock. That's when we talk about the lessons from the EU energy crisis. Thank you so much for your interaction. Thank you.